Hello again and welcome back to the Beth Chatto Gardens. It's the third week of July and we're just coming out of a heat wave. So if you are out and about in the garden, just remember to wear sunscreen and keep hydrated, and preferably wear a hat if it's in the middle of the day. So middle of July, lots of things to propagate, but the exciting thing for me is we're in bearded iris season. If you've seen bearded irises this year, you may have seen across the range some very blousy ones, some very colourful ones, and some more muted ones. Here we very much specialise in the Cedric Morris range. Of the 54 different varieties of iris we have here, and we're talking bearded irises, of those 54, 25 have all originated from Beth's relationship with Cedric Morris and the irises that he actually developed. And luckily, as you can see, we have a very nice new stock bed to dip into. Now these plants have been here for about a year and they've made up well, and when they were first planted, the rhizome was planted facing directly the sun, and with just a very little bit of weeding and a little bit of maintenance, they've made up well and they've moved into an area where we can now start to think about cropping. Now if you've got irises in your garden, you may have found that the first 2 years within the ground they've flowered incredibly well, and then when they get to year 4 and 5 they start to flower less, and when you look at them you'll see that they've got a lot more foliage. And the trick with an iris, and knowing when to lift it and when to split it, is to look at the iris from above. And what you'd expect to see is your original iris, and then either side the young would have actually developed and grown, and then maybe year 3, year 4, those young have also developed young, and where you started off with just one pointing the sun, we now have a full circle of irises. And the reason that they've stopped flowering is that the actual foliage has started to block the sunlight and the heat getting to the center of the iris. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at our stock bed, or in your case you may be looking at a flower bed, and look at the direction in which the foliage is actually forming. And what you're looking for is a complete circle. So I have one directly in front of me here, which we're going to lift up, and we'll lift a couple of clumps and then we'll go back to the shed as normal and we'll actually look at how we split them. One of the nicest plants to split. So I'm using a very large heavyweight fork, which is a landscaper's fork, and this is because it has a curve in the ties and has a lot of strength in the ties, so we can lift the plant because they're quite shallow rooted. So we want to go in from the side, and rather than trying to force the fork through, just place it in the ground, put some pressure on your foot and wiggle the handle until it slowly goes underneath the plant. And in this case, using this particular fork, once I've got all the way down to the bar being in, I can then just lean back and lift it in one go. Now make sure you don't pick it up from the actual leaves because they will break off, so you want to get your hand down low and give it a little shake, and you should be able to pick it up quite cleanly. And as you can see, we've got a circle of leaves, and this is what we're going to be addressing today. So I'll dig a couple more clumps up and then we'll head down to the shed. So again, these all three are pointing towards the sun, so I have no concerns. But this one, we can see that the leaves are actually got their back to the sun, so we'll lift that one. And we'll have this one over here. And I think one more and then we'll head towards the shed. I'll leave the fork in the flower bed for me to return to. I'll take the wheelbarrow down to the shed and we'll look at how we can propagate them. Well, we've made it to the shed and under some shade. So while we shelter from the July sun, let's have a quick word about the irises before we start to actually prop them. Initially, one should always think of an iris as a very sort of blousy plant, and most of the irises you see will be very blousy. They'll be quite frilly, and there's three elements that when describing an iris one should be aware of. One is the actual size. So tall bearded irises will come in at about 70 centimetres compared to an intermediate bearded iris which will be about 50, and then a dwarf bearded iris which will be about 30 centimetres. So you're really looking at sort of 1 foot, 2 foot and 3 foot in height, and they all sort of tend to spread to the same amount apart from the really big robust ones, and we're looking at about 1 foot to 1.5 foot, maybe 2 at the most. So we're sort of talking somewhere between 30 centimetres and say 60 centimetres. Now irises actually, regardless of the size, their flowers will be sort of relatively the same size. When they talk about the different sizes, they're talking about the different heights. So often the flowers are very, very similar. And when describing an iris flower, one should be thinking about the actual colours of the petals, the type of scent that it has, and also the colour of the beard, which is the small tongue that is coming out on each of the actual flower's petals. So you'll see that on most irises there are 3 petals that are pointing down, and these are called the fulls, and then you have 3 petals that are pointing up, and these are called the standards, and in between those two you'll see that there's a tongue that's laying sort of in the throat of the iris, and this is often used within the actual descriptions of the colour. Now a lot of irises will have a very musky smell or a very light citrus smell. When you actually have a mixed bed, they actually produce a very delightful smell that most of us will be aware of as the one that is used, say, as in a perfume. A classic perfume one is a variety called Jane Phillips, and once you smell that you'll actually recognise that as a smell that you would have smelt in other products. And like I say, there are these standards that will classify the heights of the plant, but there are also collections. So as you look at irises, you'll see that maybe you'll lean towards more the French style, which is a lot more frilly, or you'll go to maybe an English heritage one, which, you know, a lot of the irises would have been registered in the 20s and 30s and earlier. And they will be of a purer colour. They tended to have slightly less frills and slightly more uniform in the colouring. Now here our collection, like I say, is over 50, but with over half now being Cedric Morris irises, and these are very distinctive in not only that they've been immortalised within pictures which he drew and painted himself, but also in the style. And you'll find that when you look at the fulls, there's often a two-tone in the colour. Cedric never liked the frills, so there were also a very clean sort of edge to the margins of the fulls, and often the actual tongue was a vivid sort of contrasting colour. So the one that we dug up earlier is called Olive, and that's sort of predominantly sort of a pale sort of yellow, sort of a faded pale yellow on the fulls, and it has a very distinctive sort of violety sort of streaking in it. Quite nicely scented, and sort of works very well sort of with any sort of combination of planting. And you will find that the planting will either tend to be as small islands or as a sort of a swathe, because they do work well en masse. Luckily here at Beth's we have them used as islands within the garden, so you'll be able to see them in the gravel or the reservoir garden where they're being used as small islands of colour, or at the right time of year you can look across the stock beds and see sort of sometimes up to about 10,000 blooms all at once. And that flowering time is sort of 2nd to 3rd week of May and then runs for about a month. So they're a bit of a firework plant, but structurally, with their strap-like leaves and their extra height and the attractiveness of the seed pod, you'll get more from it than just the foliage. A lot of people have trouble growing irises, and often this is because they're over-tended or planted too deep. So when you're actually planting an iris or resetting an iris, always remember to ensure that the main body of the rhizome is facing the sun and is on the surface of the soil so it can bake the most. I always think of someone as a sunbather. I always think these irises are sunbathers and treat them accordingly. And I like to think of the actual leaves, which are at the back of the iris, as being like almost a sunshade, and that person doesn't want the sunshade. And it's that sort of principle that causes us the need to reset irises every so often. Unlike a lot of plants, you'll put an iris in the ground, year 2, 3, and sometimes year 4, amazing flowering years. But then they'll start to get congested and they'll start to sort of overgrow on each other. And this really does restrict its flowering ability. Often you'll find the centre of a clump of irises will actually die away because of it. So again, you know, you'll have a couple of good years, then look at renewing your stock regarding lifting it, splitting it and resetting it. And then once that's got itself established, you'll find the following year you're back into good strong flowers. So just before we take the plant, bear in mind that you'll be looking for a particular pattern, and it's easier to show you with some stones which I have here. So imagine that the sun is coming in the front of the shed and I place the first iris in its place. After about a year, you'll find that the main iris would have produced young on the side. So we've had one that's flowered and it's then produced young on the side. The following year, all of these will flower because they're still getting a large amount of light coming in from the front. They'll be coming in from the sun direction. However, once they've flowered and gone over, they will also produce young. So we have our 4 on the side of the original. They now produce young again on the sides, and so now we're starting to actually see that it's turning into a circle and it's creating its own shade, and that will stop it from flowering. Now irises do not come true from seed, so you can't collect the seed and grow them on and expect the actual same iris. Irises you can grow from seed and they'll take about 5 years to actually get to a fully flowering size, but unless you're using and doing and following a controlled propagation schedule with your seed collection, your cross-pollination and isolating them, you can't guarantee what the parentage are going to be. Some people grow them from seed and just enjoy the sort of thrill of the lucky dip of, are they going to get something that's new and original? But you'll find that all the breeders are actually looking at isolating plants, choosing the males and females and selecting, as you would with many systems, and then growing that from seed. Once they have one that they like, they will then actually allow it to make up in the ground, and everything after that will be split as one would in any form of division. So let's put the stones away and actually get the real plant out. So these are the irises that we've got from the ground earlier, and as we can see with this one, very clearly you can see how we planted. This is our main original. It's been in the ground for a couple of years and it's put the young out on the sides, and we can see that if this was facing the sun, how this foliage is actually blocking the light. So it flowered successfully this year, but next year I would pretty much guarantee that this wouldn't flower. So you've dug your plant out of the ground, and you can see how you want to reduce the mass and reset it. So the first thing you want to do is remove the flower stem. Now, like I've said, if you want to take a chance, if you want to actually propagate the seeds, it'll take about 5 years until you know what the result is, and there's no guarantee it's going to be the same. So first, remove the seed heads. One of the young ladies here is actually doing a trial, so we'll save that for her. In your garden, look down the flower stem and you should find that as it leaves the rhizome, there is a small ridge around the bottom. So when you cut the flower stem down, you want to leave about, I don't know, 25 mil, sort of about an inch from the bottom where the little ridge is, and cut above it. And this will ensure that as this stem dies away, it will die to the ridge. If you cut below it, then as it dies away, it would affect the actual original tuber. Sorry, did I say tuber? Rhizome. Now we can see that we've got 3 attached. So all you need to do is carefully remove it from the sides. Now I'm just using a pair of secateurs to cut them to get a clean cut, but you'll also find that the plant itself wants to divide. And as these develop, this little section here, just here, will thin and eventually break off. So if you haven't got secateurs and you're just out there and you've dug one up, what you can do is you can snap it off. But if you're going to snap it off, push it up and it will make a clean snap. You always push up because in its natural environment, if we weren't interfering, this would die away, or as animals move across, they would step into the middle of the plant where the plant has been dying away, and that would push this down into the ground and actually snap these off. So what we're doing is mimicking what would happen naturally by going, if that goes into the ground, effectively that would turn over the top. So there's our original. And all we're going to do is trim the bottom, and it's roughly a hand's depth. And that can then be reset back into the ground. And we can already see that we have a new young one here on the side, and this will develop as long with new ones. Place that to one side. Here is one of the ones we've taken off. All we do is strip away the first few leaves, and if you're unsure how far you should strip back, if you look on the side of your iris, you'll see that it's naturally doing it. As the iris grows, it splits the leaf from the bottom. So just look for the ones that are split and just take them off. And you've only got to peel it back, and you'll get a small ridge line appear on the top of the iris, which you can see is part of their natural pattern anyway. Then make sure that the cut is clean. And then holding the iris, you want, it's about, for me, it's about a hand's depth. It's about, give or take, about 150 mil, sort of 6 inches that you want to come up from the main body of the plant. And now, this is where you get a personal opinion. Some people cut their irises in a curve. Some, however, cut them in a V. And some cut them in a straight line. These are national differences. To be perfectly honest, no one is better than the other. They all do exactly the same. And what they're doing is taking away some of the large leafy growth to reduce the transpiration rate of the plant, so that when we replant it, we're not putting maximum stress as it's trying to support these leaves. What you'll find is that once you get them in the ground, that you'll see the centres will start to lift again straight away. Now, an interesting and bizarre thing about irises is that they effectively grow backwards. So the older an iris, the longer this will be, and you will see the ridges in it for each year. So if you're wondering about whether this is the right time to prop, if you turn an iris over, you will see that the new roots are starting to appear at the back here, and they'll always have these little yellow tips. So when you're cutting back the roots, safeguard against cutting off the little yellow tips, because you don't want to slow the actual re-rooting process. So all I'm doing is just clearing the tops, tidying the bottoms, and I now have 4, when in fact I started with 1. Now these, when they're planted back in the ground, we're going to make sure that they are sitting on the surface of the soil, and the roots are nicely in, and we're going to be aware that it's going to get bigger coming this way. So maybe plant it a bit more forward than what you want, because within the year before it flowers again, because if you think about it, you're going to put it in the ground now, we've got 11 months until it's going to be back into the world of flower. This will maybe double or at least 50% bigger, so you need to give it a little bit of space at the back. Classically, people will plant these at the front of the house where they've got a nice reflected heat off a brick wall, so make sure you don't push them next to the brick wall. Give them a bit of space to move towards it, and that will also stop you restricting your flowers. Now we can already see that these are ready to go, in that the young are starting to appear again. So when we plant them in, we want to give them enough room to to allow for these young to grow. So ideally about a trowel apart and in all directions. So I would have them a trowel apart that way and a trowel apart that way, and I would offset them so that effectively you would see them looking like that. So they're not blocking each other as they grow. Couple of other things to be aware of. They are a bit harmful if you ingest them. So, you know, they're not going to kill you, but they certainly are going to give you an upset stomach. So make sure you're wearing gloves, especially if you're doing a lot of them. So we can see that this one was in the middle. It sacrificed itself to allow the others to grow very well. So there's no point trying to save that piece. We'll strip it down as before. Cut it as before. And I'm going with a curve because I've always liked to do the curve. Also, I find on the larger ones that it's very hard to get a clean cut all the way across in one go. You can see I'm not taking away too much, I'm only taking away the leaves that have split. Now, range-wise, every colour under the sun. And ironically, iris does mean rainbow in Greek, so they were definitely covering their bases when they were talking about the colours. Now this is Benton Olive, but in all honesty, a couple of my favourites are actually Benton Menace, which was named after his cat, which I think is wonderful, and Benton Nigel, which is just an amazingly blue one. And I'm still finding myself as a collector needing to have all the others, so I'm currently on the hunt for Blue John, which hopefully I'll have next year. I supplemented the need this year by getting Blue Rhythm, which is a very nice, consistent sort of blue, but it's sort of more of a light blue, but it has a very nice lemony scent, and in fact it's one that we've started to produce here now. So you can see that if I was going to be propagating for the pot, I would expect to look at something like this to go into a 1 litre pot, this to go into a 2 litre pot, but what I'd first do is I'd look on the sides of the larger 2 litre ones and see if I've got any young, because any with young I want to go back down into the ground to just sort of like bolster the stock bed, or in the case of a flower bed, allow it to expand. Because obviously what we're looking for is many blooms as possible, and the more irises you have, the longer you'll make your flowering period, because although they do roughly all flower between sort of the middle of May and the middle of June, so you get about a month, by having different varieties you can actually extend it. There are early ones, there are late ones, and if you search for them, there are irises out there, bearded irises, which will flower twice in a season. Once sort of like in the normal summer, and then one as we're going into the sort of later part, just the beginning of autumn. So they are a lot of fun to do. They are a labour of love. You will find that you'll get yourself addicted to them. They are a bit of a Marmite plant. You'll either love them or hate them. And I genuinely have found that my love for them has grown year on year. Important things, in the spring, don't feed them. Irises are often fed as you would feed a lot of your plants, but irises do not need a lot of nitrogen. So when you give them a feed, if you've got nitrogen in that feed, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with all leafy growth and you're going to get hardly any flowers. There are mixes out there you can get specifically for irises. However, if you're unsure, one of the best things I've found is good quality potash. If you're lucky enough to have a wood burning stove and you're only burning wood on it with no chemicals in it, you can collect that ash, and in February, beginning of March, you can just sprinkle it onto the flower bed and you'll find that that will lift them. Most of the time you will find that they are problem free, and the two big problems that you may get is that if you've planted them too close together, you might get a little bit of brown spotting on the leaves, and you can see as ours have developed, we have a little bit of brown spotting, and here is what it will look like. You can see it's just a tiny little bit of a fungal problem that you can get. And the other one is what's known as root rot, and this normally happens if you leave flower heads to go to seed and you don't attend your irises. If I was to leave this in the ground, all the weight is now on the top of the plant. As the wind blows and catches the sail of the leaves, what will happen is the plant will start to rock and it will reach a point where it will fall over, exposing all of this, which will then die off. So if you're doing a seed program, about this time is when you want to go around and cut them off. And if you're just looking after them and you don't really want to do anything, you don't need to lift them, but they have got to this size, then I would highly recommend that even in the ground, you remove your flower head, pull away the old leaves, reduce the leaf mass, and take away any of the split ones. That's still in the ground, but what you'll find is that'll actually rally quite nicely. You'll get a new piece of growth here, you'll put down a lot stronger roots, and you'll get a better return for the following year. So be careful of the heat, but go out, have a go, see what you think. Hopefully you'll find that the irises that you thought had stopped blooming after the couple of years that have been in the ground, you'll revitalise, restart, and you get such a good return on your irises as long as you're dealing with plants that are 2 or 3 year olds, that you'll find that year on year you'll be able to actually identify the ones that aren't flowering, lift them, split them, and increase your general show of flowers. In the meantime, have a lovely day.